as psychedelics are becoming destigmatized and more socially accepted and medically applied. I really wanted to honor a lot of these very key moments that have inspired many people.
I think what Brian Chambers has done with this show is not just a show, it's a significant moment in art history.
There's a kind of a element to psychedelic art where it's very present, you're making it, you're living it, you're doing it, you're exploring.
This isn't some sort of hippie revival thing. This is putting this art in the place of art history, in the context of art history, and I think that's really important.
San Francisco was always the hotbed and where everything was happening. That was also where Rolling Stone magazine was started, with Rick Griffin doing the letterhead, the logo. Rolling Stone publishing the Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas artwork. And it was through Rick Griffin's work that Roger Dean found the freedom to do as he wanted, and he really identifies Rick as being the maverick that freed him creatively.
When I was working with Yes, for example, my art was like creating another world, a world possibly where the music came from, trying to make that connection. But then you put it in Helvetica and it looks like a museum piece. This is not from another world. This is imprisoned in the context of a museum. I hated that dichotomy. And Rick's stuff said it can all be from that same strange other world. So that was kind of my message from him. Make it a whole. All comes from that same place.
I consider these guys to be pivotal players in the whole psychedelic movement.
Transportation to the fantastic and frightening territory of inner space, courtesy of the most powerful mind-altering drug ever discovered, LSD-25.
There was this movie that came out called LSD-25, and they showed it in science class. And you were supposed to become nervous after seeing this movie and never want to touch drugs. Of course, it had the exact opposite effect.
Round, round, out of your mind. You think you're seeing things, I know you're blind. A million bright colors explode in your head. Today you're just high, tomorrow you're dead. Round, round.
We were just like, oh wow, that is so cool. I've got to try that immediately.
Jacaeber was a key figure in the whole concert poster movement and has had an enormous effect on my collecting, curation, and exhibiting style.
When you kind of associated these things with psychedelics, or really it was pot smoking. So that's where I started noticing something's happening here, what it is ain't exactly clear.
Rick Griffin's Post Day Oxymoxua, people bought that record because they wanted the cover. When I was a young man, I bought Yes albums for the same reason. I bought them for the record cover, not for any of the music. Then I got into the music afterwards.
By the mid-70s, we probably sold 60 million posters, cards, calendars, books, everything. And I got an enormous amount of mail. And a very high proportion of people took it for granted that my work was done under the influence of psychedelics. They would also tell me about their psychedelic experiences immersed in my art. So it kind of became it by adoption rather than by ingestion, if you like.
The paintings and the imagery that you see in this show really helped to sell the idea of the hippie movement, this extraordinary idealism that becomes individualism later. If you want to change the world, you have to do it from an individual perspective. And it's a cultural moment, and the paintings really mark that cultural change.
It's just always an amazing thing to see the art connected to the culture and how the art was changing the culture as well as reflecting the culture at the same time. We need to recognize its roots in outlaw culture, but people who consume any form of drugs now don't necessarily need to be outlaws. Hopefully this will capture a moment, but will no longer reflect the reality of people being censored and or put in jail for their beliefs and their consumption.
I mean, the name psychedelic solution, that's LSD. I mean, our logo was a drop.
Jacaeber Kastor was there. He knew what was going on and the importance of the psychedelic and visionary art movement way back in the day. He was saving the posters that were being printed almost off the press.
I was trying to say it without really saying it, but it was art that owed something to the psychedelic experience.
For example, LSD blotter sheets. They were never conceived of as works of art in their own right, and many of them have been destroyed, obviously being consumed in order to find the psychedelic experience. What Jacaeber Kastor did in preserving those and displaying them as important cultural artifacts, that's absolutely a significant moment in the development of the art history of psychedelic and visionary art.
To see all this stuff like tying back to like how the New York psychedelic movement kind of helped keep all this stuff together. I'm from New York. It was just on a bunch of different angles, coming together of these worlds that I never drew the threads myself.
Rick Griffin definitely was the king of the concert poster movement.
He's got a very high batting average. I guess he's definitely a Hall of Famer. Rick, I think, had this quest going for how all the pieces fit together. The history of kind of mysticism, religion, and thought. You know, he's always reading these books and questing and searching, trying to put it all together. Very kind of romantic in a certain way.
The flying eye is an extraordinary icon of the period, but it also has a deep linkage into art history. The flying eye is on the dollar bill. You find it in alchemical symbolism as a symbol for the eye of God who's looking over the world. And when we look out at the universe, we see the eye of God looking back at us. Alberti had the flying eye, not unlike the ones that Rick Griffin drew, as his personal token. It goes back to ancient Egypt, where you see the eye as the symbol that guarded the entrances to temples. And this is a very, very old symbol indeed.
Roger Dean, I consider the UK heir apparent to Rick Griffin because he has done more album covers than anyone, and Rick Griffin was a major inspiration for him.
I just love the freedom, and it gave me that freedom to do anything, not just to do what he did, but to do anything.
My dad wasn't a huge visual art fan. He was really into music. And so like I was raised on Yes. I didn't know like how deep Roger Dean's work had gone before this show.
So many things make Ralph Steadman unique. He's a Briton working with a drug-addled maniac.
If you meet him, he's the most charming, gentle, wonderful man that you've ever met. But you see his artwork and it can be violent and offensive and grotesque.
He really mastered the bad trip, didn't he?
One of the drawings that Ralph Steadman did of Hunter Thompson was of Hunter Thompson with a suitcase dripping pills. It's an excessive, degenerate kind of version of the late 60s and early 70s. It's very different to the idealism of Roger Dean. And I think that points to the multivalent aspect of the hippie culture in the 1970s. It wasn't all peaches and cream and a nice utopia. There were layers and sections of the culture which were messy and bloody and unpleasant. And this kind of revolutionary dismantling of the norms of society, right? We expect to see respect for the leaders of society, and Ralph Steadman certainly wasn't having any of that.
They were both extremely political men, educated on what was going on at the world at the time, and they had something to say about it.
It's highbrow because his subject matter is so deep and he's saying these really big statements politically and theoretically and everything, but then the actual content is really funny and kind of playful.
There's a Ralph Steadman piece with the attorney in the bathtub that I had never seen before that was so sort of fundamentally upsetting and also so wonderful.
The world that we live in is not an ideal world. It's certainly not utopian. And Ralph Steadman is deliberately trying to point at those things which are disruptive and broken and look at them and to say, hey, this is not right.
I was so honestly moved by the show. It's like an out-of-body experience to be next to a piece that you've seen your whole life and then really to look at the details down to the tiny pencil lines, just like a great experience.
You know, a lot of this material had been locked up in storage or in Jan Winter's closet, and it took 20 solid years of daily thought and manifestation to bring these things out of the closet and onto the wall so that they can be seen and enjoyed by everyone.
I mean, it was beyond my comprehension that such a thing could be acquired. I mean, from an historical perspective, I think it's the number one association that you make with Rolling Stone magazine is Hunter Thompson. The number one association you make with Hunter Thompson is Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. It is the penultimate item that you could possibly acquire. There is no greater holy grail. From an historically significant standpoint, he started to tie into all this significance of Rolling Stone and that early 60s movement. I mean, it changed the course of our country forever. I mean, I don't think I can overstate how important it is, and it ties it all together. So you really have the number one Rolling Stone collectible, the number one Ralph Steadman collectible, the number one Hunter Thompson collectible, all sort of brought into a set of drawings. What's most interesting about, Brian specializes in collaborative art, but he's even going back in a historical context and highlighting the interesting collaborations that happened in the past. I don't think anybody's done that. I think that's so important, and I think it's such a valuable service. It's one of the few collaborations that lasted through time.
There are 4 Godfathers in this show, but I think it's important to note that Brian Chambers is the 5th Godfather. He is carrying forward the psychedelic and visionary tradition. The new psychedelic movement is centered around this place.